Tonight on Free Minds TV, new data out of New York City suggests that there is a heavy racial disparity in the way that sentences are handed down for marijuana possession. We'll also be discussing the arrest of an Amish person, the expansion of the use of deadly force in New Hampshire, and Ron Paul. That coming up tonight on Free Minds TV.
Welcome everybody to a brand new edition of Free Minds TV, where we challenge you, the viewer, to think outside the box. With you as always is Toby.
And Nick.
You know, Nick, we've got a lot to talk about tonight. We are going to be talking about not only one Amish man going to jail for a few days, but a whole myriad of them. We'll be getting into exactly why that is, has to do with, you guessed it, their religious convictions. We're also, it's been a while since we really talked about Ron Paul. There's so many different things we could talk about with his campaign. We'll be getting into a few of them, as well as a short little movie clip at the end of this show for viewers who don't really know their history with, you know, the United States use of the military overseas, so to speak.
The use of the military, the use of the CIA or other intelligence
installing
agencies.
dictators, overthrowing rulers, you know, doing a lot to...
Most Americans need a refresher on that because a lot of them have a very poor knowledge of U.S. foreign policy over the last few decades.
It became very clear to me, Nick, when I was watching the last GOP debate. Some pretty disgusting stuff when Ron Paul was talking about foreign policy, and I think it's important to give people a little history lesson. We'll also be getting into some good local news coming out of New Hampshire that we've been following, a story of Castle Doctrine. But first, we've been talking about this for years, Nick. I think it was recently we were talking about how the war on drugs is really racist by nature, the way it's implemented. And today we have some graphics displaying just that.
Yeah, well, what the graphics show is that it's nothing that we didn't know before, but that white people, at least in New York City, you know, based on the collection of data that they've done from 96 to 2010, it shows that white people are using a lot more marijuana than blacks and Hispanics. And in the graphic, you can see the white, I know you might not be able to read all the text, but the white bar represents whites who use marijuana. The black bar represents African Americans who use marijuana, and the red bar represents Hispanics. And it shows how many have used it, you know, within their lifetime, in the past year, and in the last month, from left to right. So you can see, in any of those situations, white people using more marijuana than blacks or Hispanics by as a percentage of the white population.
And we've known this for a long time. We've talked about it many times. And this isn't only with marijuana use. It's also true of harder drugs as well. And so one would think whoever's using more illegal substances than other racial groups, they would be the ones who had more arrests. Right, Nick? If it's all fair.
Right. Well, one would assume that if more white people, if you take racial bias out of the justice system and out of policing, then you would assume that if white people are using, you know, more marijuana than blacks or Hispanics, then there would be proportionately more arrests of whites for marijuana possession. That's not the case. And we've got another graphic that actually shows how the arrests have been allocated over the years. And you can see if you're black, far more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. And it's actually counting this in numbers of arrests. So remember, fewer black people as a percentage of the population, a smaller percentage of black people actually use marijuana out of that smaller black population, and yet way more of them get arrested for marijuana possession than whites and Hispanics. Hispanics still arrested in significantly greater numbers than whites.
It's more than double.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the number of white people who actually get busted for marijuana, compared to how many white people are using it, they don't really have all that much to fear as compared to a black person or a Hispanic who's in possession of marijuana.
The graphics are almost really reversed, literally practically reversed graphics. And not to mention that oftentimes, let's face it, there are socioeconomic reasons that even if white people are arrested for marijuana or other drug charges, they have a better chance of fighting it in court and getting those charges dismissed. I mean, that's just the fact of the matter. There are huge socioeconomic differences in systems of power and privilege, and this is the government's policy at work. This isn't something that's just been happening in the 1950s. No, those graphics ran current right up until a couple of years ago. I think it ran up in, when was it?
2010, I think, was the last year data provided.
So these are very current. This is happening right now as we speak. This isn't something that we're reporting on decades later, years later. No, this is still going on today.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's not surprising if you understand the history of the war on drugs, because the whole reason that these drug laws were implemented was to target minorities, was to come up with an excuse to either arrest Hispanics near the Mexican border. This was before immigration laws and things like that, but basically to get rid of these Mexicans or take them out of the labor force because they were not welcome competition to white workers. And the other excuse was to basically oppress black people in the South, back when that was acceptable. They wrote up that's the reason that cocaine was initially outlawed, was because it was at the time viewed as a drug that black people primarily used. And there was a lot of misinformation that went along with that, but racial discrimination definitely played a part. And whether it's the intention of people who still support the war on drugs or not, in practical terms, this is how the policy is applied in the real world today, not 20 years ago, today.
And I don't think that there's any magic wand that can be waved that can change this. I mean, these racial disparities are so embedded in the culture. It just goes to show that if we're still fighting this war on drugs in the current way it's being fought, well, it's not going to stop. Number one, it's not a winnable war. And these graphics are showing that it's also creating great racial divides. It's showing that racism is alive and well right here in the United States. Now, these graphics, I believe, are coming out of New York, is where these ones are from. But I would suspect that you'd see similar numbers in other parts of the country.
Yeah, there's nothing I can cite, but I mean, there have been national surveys that have been done.
Well, I've seen them in the past. We don't have the graphics with us.
The trend, this is indicative of what the overall trend is. White people, especially young white males, because they have a large, typically compared to the rest of society, have a fair amount of disposable income. They're actually the primary, they're, as a particular demographic group, they're the heaviest users of illicit narcotics. Young white males are not being arrested in very high numbers compared to the amount of drugs they use. It's mostly minorities.
Well, anyways, for those of you, I just think it's important to dispel the myths. There's these myths that the government isn't racist by nature, and well, some of its policies, a lot of them really are. This isn't the only one that we can point to like this. There's many other policies like this as well. So I think it's time that people really do admit the war on drugs is a failure, get rid of it because it's inherently racist. All right, moving right along, something that's also not fair to some people are the Amish. Their culture completely clashes with that of the mainstream American culture, whatever subculture you want to say it. One that's probably about as far away from mainstream America are the Amish, especially the ones that really don't use electricity for anything. They use their horses and buggies to get around, living off the land, etc., etc. And we've talked about many stories over the years of the Amish running afoul of the law because, well, they have religious prescriptions that teach them to do otherwise. I don't know all the Muslim faith and all the reasons they do what they do. You
mean the Amish faith?
What did I say, Muslim? I'm so sorry. I meant Amish faith. I don't know the Muslim faith all that much either. Well, faiths in general, they go over my head. But, they're out there. People should be able to believe what they want, practice the religion that they want. And it makes it hard when you have roads that are policed by Westerners when you live a life and a religion that is very different. This coming from Kentucky, where Mose Yoder stood in Graves District Court Monday afternoon, rested his bearded chin in his hand, and answered the question from Judge Deborah Hawkins Crooks. She told him he owed $158 in fines and court costs for refusing to display a bright orange-red safety triangle on the back of his horse-drawn buggy. "Mr. Yoder, do you intend to pay the amount?" she asked. He shook his head silently. And then she sentenced him to 4 days in the county jail. In all, Crooks sentenced to 9 Amish men to between 3 and 10 days in jail, beginning late Monday night, for the refusal to pay fines on religious grounds. The men said that paying the fines would amount to complying with a law they believe violates their religious strictures against wearing bright colors or trusting in man-made symbols for their safety. So, I didn't know that about them, but apparently I do know that plain, they don't like the bright colors, but I didn't know that it was against their religion to have man-made items for safety reasons. Okay. I don't think it's right to put somebody in jail for practicing their religious belief, but that's what we'll do if that's what it takes to abide by the biblical laws, one of the men, Levi Zook, said before the hearing, which was held in a courtroom packed with dozens of Amish men. As it turned out, a friend of the defendants, John Villa, and Podoric paid Zook's fines so he could care for his alien son with cerebral palsy, one of his 7 children. God has laid it on me to do so, he said. But the other 8 were to report to jail before 11 on Monday. Now, it looks like the fines ranged in prices between $148 and $600 for failing to put up the yield signs. The Amish are being represented by some civil liberties attorneys, it looks like, and who are trying to appeal this to the state Supreme Court, but they have not yet decided if they're going to rule on it. You know, Nick, I don't know. To me, a horse and buggy driving down the road, I think to a certain extent it should be up to the Westerners to say that's a slow-moving vehicle, but I guess not up to the Western laws. The Westerners say, no, it's up to the Amish to tell people they're slow. We can't tell if a horse and buggy is a slow-moving vehicle unless it has a bright orange triangle on the back of it.
Yeah, I don't think it really presents all that much of a safety issue. The Amish do run into these problems because really they've got the religious, and I really don't understand the faith in a whole lot of detail, but a lot of the religious objections they have are to using modern technology and things like that, and this means that they don't comply with a lot of safety regulations or a lot of these newer agricultural regulations and things like that, building codes, because simply they have an objection to using the technologies and things that would be required for compliance. So they're not necessarily rejecting the state's authority because they're directly trying to confront it, but their religious code instructs them to live in a certain way. And frankly, everything I do understand about the Amish, I mean, they're peaceful people. They live in their own communities. They're not a cult. And they're basically just very decent neighbors.
Yeah, they're very plain.
Right. It's not a way I'd want to live, but
right.
They're not bad people by any stretch of the imagination. And
they don't
actually,
really
they're probably a lot
others.
better than the rest of us.
Yes, I know a little bit about them from just Western movies and Western books. I read The Plain Truth by Jodi Picoult, and that's about as far as it goes. I think I also watched Witness with Harrison Ford. That's about as much as I read. And these stories, of course, that we come up all the time, whether it be raw milk or safety triangles or what have you, that come up. Other than that, I just know that they're very plain and simple people. But they're just living,
what they're doing is for religious reasons, they're living a very traditional lifestyle, and really all they're doing is they're being self-sufficient, not necessarily as rugged individuals, but within their own communities. They're living according to a they're pretty good at self-regulating based on their religious code. They're living a very traditional lifestyle, and they don't have a lot. I'm sure that for a lot of young people who don't want to live that lifestyle, it's a difficult way to grow up. But you, as a young person, the Amish culture, you are offered the chance to go out into the rest of society for a period of time, and then presumably you choose to come back. Some don't, but it's not a cult where they try to keep you from ever leaving or ever seeing what else is out there.
No, and actually, in fact, they encourage it. I forget what it's called, but when the young Amish children get, when they're teenagers, they are encouraged to go out and see what Western life is like, to see if they want to live a plain life or they'd rather embrace a Western culture and everything that comes with it. And so that's very much encouraged, and to encourage their children to go out and check out what the Western culture is.
But what you've got people who've solemnly made that. I mean, the adults there who have been through that phase and have come back and are living as Amish. They've made the individual choice that this is the lifestyle they want to lead. They want to be part of this religious order, this religious group, and really all they do is mind their own business, worship God according to the way they believe He ought to be worshipped, and support themselves. And this is a problem. The society we live in today is so focused on obedience and compliance. It's so heavily regulated that simply going out into the countryside, living with a self-sustaining community that for the most part pretty much just minds its own business and provides, for their own survival largely. I mean, they do trade. It's not like they're completely separate. I mean, some Amish they do sell their products.
There's different levels. I guess these people call themselves the Old Order. What is that? Schwarzentruber? Schwarzentruber. I can't pronounce regular words, let alone those.
But and certainly there's some who aren't as strict.
Exactly, but these ones are these ones. This particular order is more religious or stricter than others. And I also want to point out before we move on that this is not just an isolated case of just these 9 men who were found guilty. As of Monday, this judge, Judge Deborah Hawkins, has 44 more cases on her docket involving the same type of charge. So, I mean, these are recurring themes that these Amish don't want to put the slow-moving vehicles on their horse and buggies, and the state is making them. Once again, I will argue that any Westerner who is too stupid to know that horses are slow-moving, well, they don't deserve to have a driver's license now, do they? Right?
You would think so. I mean, unfortunately, they're basing this...
Do pedestrians have to put a sign on their back now?
Well, regardless of that, I understand they're making a case based on religious convictions, and that's certainly something to consider in its own right, but you also have to consider, what if I just wanted to go and live this lifestyle? I mean, even if I'm not Amish, what if I just wanted to go and live in basically this way? Get off the grid and, have a horse-drawn carriage instead of a car. Could I actually do that, or would the state be pestering me too? Well, in fact, they would. And there's really no way at this point to just opt out, which seems absurd to me. Like, if you want to live on a farm and swear off of modern technology out in the countryside, you can't even do that because the government still maintains that no matter where you are, they have to, you're still subject to their mandates, whether you're hurting anybody or not.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a subsistence farmer anymore. I think we've talked about this recently. I mean, even if you could completely live off the land, you owned your own land, there was no mortgage on it or anything, and you could live off the land, you wouldn't be able to because you have to pay taxes. And it's not like in the olden days where the king just comes down and decrees that he wants a certain percentage of your crops. I'll take half of your apples and a third of your pumpkins and et cetera, et cetera. No, you have to go and do business with the outside community now. He's not just taking your crop anymore like he used to. The Western man has decided, the Western governments have decided that you need to go out and become a businessman. You need to get licenses, and then you need to sell your crop in order to pay the taxes on the land that you owe. So you're right, there's no such thing as a subsistence farmer. They've made it impossible, which is sad.
Right.
I know.
We're all locked into the system whether we like it or not. I'm sure there's some parts of the world where you could get away with it.
Not here in the freest country in the world.
Not here in the U.S.
All right. Well, we've got other things to talk about. Some good news, actually, coming up here right from New Hampshire, where we're recording this from. We're all over the country, and people watch us all over the world, but we do like to cover some New Hampshire stories because, well, that's where we live.
Right, that is where we live.
And it's good news, no matter where it would be.
Right, and New Hampshire, the state legislature, has overridden a veto by Governor Lynch, and Governor Lynch had vetoed an expansion of the use of deadly force provision in the law, which many people would refer to as the Castle Doctrine. House lawmakers voted 251 to 111 on this past Wednesday, the 14th, to override the governor's July veto of a bill that calls for permitting people to use deadly force in self-defense, regardless of the location. The Senate previously voted in favor of the action with the required two-thirds majority needed to adopt the bill into law. So what they're saying here is that unlike previously in New Hampshire, where you really only had a right to use a codified right to use deadly force in self-defense on your property or it was rather vague about the property surrounding it. They actually use the word curtilage. So the question is, does that mean all of the property where I reside or just the dooryard, or what does that mean? Now, the law enforcement officials around the state and the governor were very critical of this. According to their account, drug gangs are going to be shooting it out everywhere and using this successfully as defense, I guess we're supposed to believe. All this law says is that if there's a threat to your life on the street, if somebody pulls a gun or a knife on you, you don't have to make a show out of trying to retreat before you draw a weapon and defend yourself. Whereas previously, and this doesn't go into effect until November, so I guess I could say presently, in New Hampshire, if somebody pulls a knife or a gun on you and you have a reasonable fear that they're going to try to kill you, as it stands right now, you're expected to attempt to run away from somebody who has a weapon, which is actually, if you have a means of defending yourself, is probably a bad idea. I don't know. Turning my back on the guy with the gun or the knife, number one, I don't know if he intends to pull the trigger or not, so bullets move a lot faster than I can run. I know that. If somebody pulls a knife on me, I really don't want to find out that they can run faster than me when they catch up to me with a knife. So that's the present reality. That's what people are saying is the reasonable thing to do is, well, if somebody pulls a gun on you, try to run away. That's absurd. I mean, if you actually have the means to defend yourself, you feel your life's threatened, you're not, in a situation like that, you really don't have time to run away. So people defending themselves from the use of deadly force currently, since this law hasn't gone into effect yet, if they defend themselves on the street or somewhere that's not their residence, they actually face prosecution for that, which seems absurd.
And even in your house, you're supposed to try to escape, if at all possible.
And for those of you who think this is some kind of strange New Hampshire provision that got through, the story I have here says that about 30 states have some form of Castle Doctrine or stand your ground provision in the law. So actually, most of the states...
We're playing catch-up.
Right. Most of the states actually have this codified into law. And if there's a threat to your life, you have the right to defend yourself regardless of where you are and regardless of whether that's codified into law. I mean, there are unfortunately still some places where you might face prosecution for that, and especially outside of the United States. I mean, you think we have it bad here. Go over to the UK and look at some of the stories they have there about people who've been prosecuted for defending themselves. It's pretty absurd. So, but you have a right to not be killed and to keep someone from killing you regardless of where you are. The government, I'm glad that the state has decided to codify that and remove the fear that people legitimately defending themselves might be prosecuted. And that was for the concern about drug dealers blasting each other. I don't think that's too likely. You actually have to be defending yourself, not robbing somebody for drug money.
All right, well, we're running low on time, so let's get to it. Ron Paul, we haven't talked about him in a little while. We've been talking about Gary Johnson recently, who's getting absolutely no press. But Ron Paul is someone we've been talking about for years. He is probably the only candidate that's being taken seriously right now, at least by some people, who has a chance of winning. He's a pretty principled guy. If you haven't heard about him, I'd say Google Ron Paul. Is probably if you don't know who he is yet. And you might not know who he is because he is still being excluded in a very big way by the mainstream media. He's someone who's principled. He believes in less government. He doesn't believe in the government getting involved in your own lives and in your personal lives unless you're harming other people. And you know what? He doesn't believe in having this giant military spread throughout the entire world. There's a lot of rumors about Ron Paul's stances. I've been hearing people say all sorts of things like, oh, I heard Ron Paul wants a constitutional amendment to ban gay marriage. No, Ron Paul wants the government out of marriage in general. So I'd say if you've heard rumors about Ron Paul that you don't know are true, Google them and check them out. But I do want to talk about him because there's a couple of stories that came across my attention over the last few days that I think are noteworthy to talk about. Of course, if you haven't heard, I was surprised that my local paper printed a big article about Ron Paul winning the GOP California straw poll by over 44%, taking almost half the vote, beating out Romney and Perry and Bachmann and all the other candidates by a landslide over there. Then again, Ron Paul does very well in straw polls, so what's that matter? Well, CNN also did a poll saying that he is the most electable presidential candidate against President Barack Obama. 52% going to Obama, still 45% going to Ron Paul. In the hypothetical general election, Romney was down 11 points, so significantly more than Ron Paul versus Obama. So that's CNN's own poll. CNN also had a poll over the last couple days showing that Ron Paul is now in third place nationally being polled, only 6 points behind Romney, and then coming in next would be Perry. Yet on their own, I was looking at their website today, and on the CNN online web poll, Ron Paul's not even listed as a candidate. Says, quick vote, which GOP candidate has the best shot of being elected president? And then you have Bachmann, Perry, and Romney. No Ron Paul. So deliberately leaving him out, that seems fishy. Anyways, let's check out this debate clip real quick from the other night.
We are not being attacked, and we were not attacked because of our actions. We were attacked, as Newt talked about, because we have a civilization that is antithetical to the civilization of the jihadists. And they want to kill us because of who we are and what we stand for. And we stand for American exceptionalism. We stand for freedom and opportunity for everybody around the world. And I am not ashamed to do that.
30 seconds, Mr. Paul.
As long as this country follows that idea, we're going to be under a lot of danger. This whole idea that the whole Muslim world is responsible for this and they're attacking us because we're free and prosperous, that is just not true. Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda have been explicit. They have been explicit, and they wrote and said that we attacked America because you had bases on our Holy Land in Saudi Arabia. You do not give Palestinians a fair treatment, and you have been bombing. I didn't say that. I'm trying to get you to understand what the motive was behind the bombing. At the same time, we had been bombing and killing hundreds of thousands of Iraqis for 10 years. Would you be annoyed? If you're not annoyed, then there's some problem.
All right, we're going to stay on this subject. We have a question from the audience.
Scary. People don't even want to see it. Well, we're out of time for tonight. Until next week, it's been Toby here with you.
And Nick.
And we're going to leave you today with some graphic footage. So if you're squeamish, I suggest you change the channel. But this is what your tax dollars have done. This is what Ron Paul was talking about, why other people are mad at America because of our foreign policy. Have a good night. I'm sorry, this is what America does to people.